Okay, let's take a look at the consequences of social class. So basically what we're thinking about here is how does social class affect our lives. And so as you can see, we have a list of factors up here. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but it should give us a pretty good idea about illustrating how many aspects of our lives this concept of social class actually touches. So we can just take these in turn and we'll discuss them each. So we could say, how does social class affect my physical health? And the simplest answer to that is, in a society, a capitalist society, such as ours, that a lot of times access to medical care is based on ability to pay. So clearly in our society right now there's a very large debate about the ideas of health care, and certainly we don't have to get into a debate about either side of the argument to recognize, just in a non-biased or impartial way, that clearly access to medical care is based on, to a large degree, our social class. So we can say that upper classes certainly have increased ability to pay for and have more access to medical care than you people of the lower classes. Some other research basically points to the idea that people of lower class tend to lead more unhealthy lifestyles. So again, access to food. We sometimes talk about food scarcity, especially in urban areas where we can clearly see that the ability to easily have access to fresh food and what we consider healthier foods is limited, whereas access to corner stores and fast food is enormous. So lots of processed food. So we talk about the influence of diets. Clearly the lower classes are more subject to use and abuse drugs and alcohol, as well as also sometimes engage in more unsafe sexual practices, which definitely sometimes leads to more physical health problems. And of course physical health is very closely tied to mental health, which we'll discuss in just a second. But clearly if a person is undergoing huge amounts of stress in their lives, which again you can imagine that lower social classes are in a lot of ways subject to not necessarily the only types of stress, but certainly sometimes more dire types of stress, and stress is certainly a factor in our physical health. So when we talk about mental health, clearly we can talk about stress. Studies have definitely pointed to the idea that the mental health status of the lower classes is generally lower than those of the upper classes. Again, affective stress being one of them. The lower classes are much more likely to suffer the adverse effects of divorce. They're more likely to be the victims of crime. And again, so sometimes the reality of poverty all have adverse effects on mental health. And of course, we can just talk about the difference between the upper classes and lower classes. That the upper classes generally feel, while not to say that they don't have any problems or stress or strife in their lives, there's generally more of a sense of control, or at least an access to options among the upper classes that the lower classes don't have, and that can manifest itself in mental health issues. Family life. We can definitely look at the idea of, first of all, how do we choose to a large degree who we are going to, again, we're born into our family of origin, but for many of us then who will choose to get either married or start a long-term relationship, possibly even then start a family or family of procreation, does our social class have something to do with those people that we may choose to do that with? And while we differentiate between a class society and a caste society, and that a social class society does not necessarily have prohibitions against who we can marry, that endogamy term that we talked about earlier, that there is to a certain degree a lot of social pressure for people to sometimes kind of quote unquote stay within their class when it comes to dating and certainly marriage. In fact, we have all sorts of derogatory terms for people in our society who do not. So, again, terms that you'll often hear, gold digger, or the concept of people kind of dating below themselves, or, so all these are, again, derogatory, sometimes gender-specific terms about people who are quote-unquote not staying within their class. So there'll be a lot of pressure from family and friends for people to kind of quote-unquote stick with your class or stay with the people you know. We definitely know that, again, divorce rates are higher among the lower classes, resulting in more what we generally term broken homes and all the conditions that entails. Education, very similar to physical health. Education in our society a lot of times is based on an ability to pay for it. We definitely say that among the upper classes, we definitely see it in research, that there is much more of an emphasis placed on gaining or continuing education. So it's much more of an expectation that students at very least will graduate high school if not continue on in higher education, whereas the lower classes sometimes more of an emphasis on earning a living, which may or may not be related directly to education. We often see that, again, we can talk about levels of education among various institutions and say that, let's say, a community college like HAC is much more likely to kind of espouse and focus on what we might call working class values, as opposed to, let's say, an Ivy League college or a university like Harvard, in which you definitely expect to find more upper class values kind of enmeshed in the culture of that type of an educational setting. Religion, we often sometimes think of religion as kind of transcending class, and certainly to a lot of ways it does, but we also can definitely point to trends that patterns of worship definitely tend to follow class lines, where people, again, tend to group with other people of similar social classes themselves when they decide where to worship. So you could even look at, let's say, an inner city Christian church and a Christian church of the same denomination out in the suburbs, and find that there's not a lot of mixing between those two groups. That if a family from, let's say, the inner city decided to go and attend a church service at, let's say, a affluent suburban neighborhood, they may often feel very out of place, or in some, maybe extreme cases, kind of unwelcome, because they're surrounded by people of a different social class, even though you might be talking about the exact same religious denomination. So again, religion is sometimes a way of, when people gather together, of reinforcing class identity. We talk about politics, influenced by class. Again, in the United States, and again, inserting my own personal thing here, this kind of sticks in my craw sometimes, but two-class system. So when we talk about Republicans and Democrats being the two major political parties in the United States, we can clearly see that those distinguish themselves to a certain degree along class lines. We talk about Republicans, we're generally talking about political messages and policies which focus on the upper classes. So again, maintaining and protecting wealth, generally when we associate with the Republican class, or Republican Party, I'm sorry. And then when we talk about the Democratic Party, we're usually talking about more, again, working class values and the maintenance of social programs which benefit generally people of the middle to lower classes. So clearly politics can be influenced by social class. And again, not by any means the last or only remaining way that social class affects our lives is in the ways that we as a society experience crime and sometimes, again, deal with the criminal justice system. Statistics absolutely point out that people of the lower classes are much more likely in their lifetimes to be subject to arrest, and much more likely to be connected in some way to the criminal justice system. So whether or not they're actually in prison or engaged in some ways with the criminal justice system, such as being on probation or parole. And then we can look at the flip side of that coin, is that people living in lower class neighborhoods are much more likely to suffer the negative deleterious aspects of crime. So in other words, not even just to perhaps be the direct victims of crime, but certainly neighborhoods that experience high rates of crime are going to experience a lot of other problems, such as low property values or just a general feeling, kind of like I said, of not being safe. So we can clearly see a lot of these also tie in with each other. But in each of these aspects, we can clearly see, and if we were to look at our own situation in each of these factors, we realize that the social class we belong to does have a great bearing on